Imagine waking up to find tanks on your street, owned not by an enemy army, but by the bank that holds your mortgage. In 1933, a group of billionaires wrote a check for $300 million to buy your freedom. They did not want to vote. They wanted a Caesar in the White House to turn the United States into a private Wall Street colony. Today you will see the names of the families who signed this sentence and realize why their plan simply moved into the shadows. The Republic was up for sale, and the buyers are still in control today. The final harvest of democracy is happening right now. In 1933, a group of the wealthiest men in America met in a wood-paneled room to sign a death warrant for democracy. They didn't want to vote. They wanted a dictator. They were ready to spend $300 million to buy the White House. The world remembers the Great Depression as a time of breadlines and poverty. But the declassified files of the business plot reveal a hidden war for the soul of the nation. While the public looked to President Roosevelt for hope, the titans of Wall Street were looking for a leader. By the end of this journey, you will see the secret checks that funded the plotters. You will discover the name of the Marine General who was chosen to be the American Caesar. And you will see why the archives of this betrayal were scrubbed to protect the names of families. The project was born from pure, concentrated greed. The elite were terrified of the New Deal. They saw the government's attempt to help the poor as a biological threat to their wealth. They used the logic of the identity factory to replace the nation's personality with a script. The name of the conspiracy was never officially recorded, but the investigators called it the business plot. It was a clinical plan to seize the capital and install a general secretary who would answer only to the banks. They spent millions to recruit abandoned veterans. The man leading the recruitment was Gerald McGuire. He was a bond salesman with a background in military intelligence. He did not look for soldiers in the mud. He looked for them in the elite clubs of New York. He was building a mighty Wurlitzer of political influence. The budget for the coup was laundered through a network of shell companies. They were ready to provide weapons, uniforms, and a narrative of national salvation. The machinery of total betrayal was operating in the heart of the financial district near the Federal Reserve. Imagine waking up to find tanks on Pennsylvania Avenue, not from a foreign enemy, but from the companies that owned your mortgage. To the architects of the plot, the American public was not a citizenry. They were biological assets to be managed by a corporate board. The declassified memos show that the plotters were in direct contact with the rising fascist regimes in Europe. They wanted to import the human filter protocols from Berlin to deal with unproductive elements of the population. The harvest was becoming ideological. The air in the secret meetings was thick with the scent of expensive brandy and high-level treason. The oligarchs discussed the survival trigger of the elite. They were building a world where the boundary between a CEO and a king was a single armed insurrection. The transition from lobbying to insurgency happened with a single invitation. They reached out to a man who had more medals than any soldier in history. They needed a hero to mask their crime. They turned to Smedley Butler in 1933. They thought his loyalty could be bought with $1 million check. The countdown to the March on Washington had begun. The biological ghosts of the Great War were being mobilized for a mission they did not understand. They were the raw materials for social engineering. The gateway to the modern era of deep state control was opening in a hotel suite in New York. The billionaires thought they were just fixing a broken system. No, the archives reveal that they were creating the blueprint for a world where the government is just a front. But then, the plotters made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the conscience of the man they tried to hire. Smedley Butler was not a human robot. He was a witness. The architects of the business plot found out that a secret is only as safe as the man who keeps it. The locomotives of the conspiracy were hissing in the dark. The cargo was loaded. It was a generation of veterans ready to be used as a blunt instrument against their own home. The train reached the first stop in the shadow of the White House. The final harvest was seconds away. Smedley Butler was the most dangerous man in America for the billionaires. He was a two-time Medal of Honor recipient who the troops called Old Gimlet Eye. He was a warrior who had seen the blood harvest in every corner of the globe. He did not see a salesman. He saw a snake. Maguire offered Butler a terrifying deal. He wanted him to lead an army of 500,000 veterans to Washington. The goal was to force the administration to step aside. They wanted to create a new cabinet position for a permanent dictator in the United States. The declassified reports show that the plotters had already secured the weapons. They were working with major arms companies to provide the hardware for the guards of the identity factory. They were building a private military force that stood above every law. The records mention a loyalty ledger where the names of every high-ranking officer were tracked against their potential price. The government was being dismantled as a series of line items in a corporate budget. They were looking for the resilient assets to guard the order. The scientists involved in the early Project Bluebird protocols were watching the social unrest. They wanted to know if a mass trigger could be activated through the veterans. They were using the poverty of the Depression to calibrate the induced anxiety of the entire nation. But Smedley Butler played a double game. He pretended to go along with the plot to find the names of the invisible editors behind the money. He realized that the businessmen were not just angry. They were clinical. They were practicing for the moral reset in the files. The contrast between the patriotic language of the plotters and the reality of their fascist blueprint is bone-chilling. They wanted to build a future of order while they were planning the death of the Constitution. They were playing both sides of the flag for dominance. The countdown to the whistleblowing had begun. Butler met with the leaders in various secret locations. He saw the ghost planes of their ambition, a world where the elite had an exit button for democracy. He was recording the seconds of the Republic's survival. The transition from observation to exposure happened in November 1934. Butler walked into a congressional committee and laid out the entire map of the betrayal. He named the names that were never supposed to be heard outside the boardrooms. But the mighty Wurlitzer of the media was ready. The major news outlets mocked Butler's testimony. They used the same sanitization techniques we saw in the White Coat files. They labeled the most decorated Marine in history as a conspiracy theorist to bury the truth. The declassified memos from the committee reveal a panic inside the halls of Congress. They found that Butler was telling the truth. The evidence of the fund was real. No, the committee realized that the plotters were too big to fail. They were the owners of the nation. The military responded with Operation Amnesia. They deleted the names of the billionaires from the official public report. They wanted to ensure that the business plot was remembered as a joke rather than a threat. They were protecting the Signal Zero for the next generation. As the files were closed, a final document was added to the vault. It was labeled Project Gabriel, Corporate Integration. It stated that the business plot data was now the foundation for the next century of political management. The harvest was moving to the ballot box. Everything we have uncovered points to a single conclusion. The coup that started in 1933 never failed. It just changed its form. It became the invisible editor that manages your perception of the world today. The factory is still running in the light. The documents they tried to burn are finally screaming in the declassified archives. And the truth they tell is about to dismantle the history of the free world. The kidnapping of the soul was the primary objective of the oligarchs. And today they have more souls than ever. The shadow behind the plot was the House of Morgan. In 1933, J.P. Morgan Jr. was the invisible editor of the American economy. He viewed the government as a branch of his own bank. The files show that his agents directed the identity factory scouts. The plotters were not just looking for a dictator. They were looking for market stability. They believed that democracy was too noisy for the high-speed calculations of Wall Street. They wanted a system of total resource management where the population was liquid capital. The declassified ledgers show that the associates were funding the American Liberty League. This was the public face of the business plot. It was a masterpiece of perception management. They used the language of freedom to sell the architecture of slavery in the dark. The documents reveal that the League was sharing data with the same psychological experts who later worked on mind control. They wanted to know how to condition the American worker to accept lower wages through mass suggestion. They were building the digital cage. The project leaders were now working on Phase 5. This was the plan to use the Montauk frequency to synchronize the consumer habits of the nation. They wanted to create a biological market where your desires were programmed by a signal from the bank. The scientists were obsessed with the idea of a permanent monopoly. They wanted to own the energy, the food, and the thoughts of the entire human race. They were building the digital cage in the shadows. The identity factory was becoming a global trade network. But the Whitecoat Volunteers and the Liberty League were starting to report identity leaks. They realized that the scripts they were reading were pieces of a larger deception. The CIA files suggest that the Signal Zero was first tested in these early corporate campaigns. The transition from money to mind was complete. The oligarchs realized that you do not need a general if you can control the invisible editor in every household. They began moving their assets from the business plot into the media empires of the Mockingbird files. The declassified reports from 1946 reveal a panic inside the Morgan Bank. A group of investigators had found a copy of the Samson Protocol in a private vault. They were ready to show the world that the owners of America had their own final option for the Republic. The military responded with Operation Deep Cover. They used the same techniques developed in the Monster Study to bury the investigation. They labeled the evidence as forgeries and Soviet propaganda. They were trying to erase the last link to the fascist plot. The contrast between the philanthropy shown in the newsreels and the reality of the Morgan files is bone-chilling. The government was building a future of charity while the elite were creating a system of harvesting. They were playing both sides of the ledger for dominance. The countdown to the modern era of corporate personhood had begun. The human filters of Wall Street were being replaced by the algorithms of today. The military realized that a dollar is effective, but a digital signal is absolute. The harvest moved to the smartphone. Imagine finding out that your entire political spectrum was designed by a man in a top hat 70 years ago. This is the realization that is starting to hit the collective consciousness in 2026. The veil is finally starting to thin around the Project Gabriel Labs. The declassified pages suggest that the business plot was just the beta test for a much larger operation. An operation that does not need a Marine Caesar or a secret army. It only needs your data to stay connected to the grid. The signal is active again right now. As we turn the page, the names on the list are still being updated. The ghost planes are still in the sky, and the blood harvest is still being calculated in the cloud. The only difference is that now you know who signed the checks. The countdown to the awakening is here. The failure of the business plot in 1934 was the greatest victory for the deep state in history. They learned that a direct coup is too visible. They realized they needed a silent takeover. They began building a state within a state that would stand for a century. The declassified ledgers show the budget for the shadow government. They allocated billions to create a parallel infrastructure of hospitals, newsrooms, and laboratories. This was the true birth of the identity factory we have been tracking through every secret file. The project leaders were obsessed with long-term conditioning. They wanted to ensure that the next generation would be biological ghosts, unable to remember the democracy their grandfathers fought for. They were using the Amnesia-9 logic on a national scale. The records mention a Project X that took place in 1958. They were testing the corporate sync protocols on an entire town in the Midwest. They wanted to see if they could vote a specific outcome through a radio frequency alone. The state owned the choice. The scientists involved in the Tuskegee harvest were also looking at the data. They wanted to know if the bad blood of poverty made a population more receptive to authoritarian scripts. They were looking for the genetic key to the obedient citizen in the Maryland woods. The transition from warfare to management was complete. The generals realized that a managed crisis is much more efficient than a managed peace. They began creating the scripts of history that we see in our news feeds today. The identity factory was achieving total scale. But the biological ghosts of the business plot were starting to wake up. In the 1970s, a group of researchers found a set of redacted receipts in a warehouse. These receipts showed payments to the same families who had funded the coup in '33. The agency responded with the Great Purge of 1973. They wanted to wipe the memory of the shadow government from the face of the earth. But they missed a small box of memos in a basement in New York that proved the owners were still in the room. These memos describe a Phase 6 protocol for the year 2024. They wanted to use the Montauk frequency to activate the sleeper mode of the entire American population. They were preparing for the final integration of the factory into the digital cloud. The contrast between the elections shown on television and the reality of the Phase 6 files is bone-chilling. The government was building a future of participation while the elite were creating a system of calibrated silence. They were playing both sides of the screen. Imagine finding out that your vote was just a data point for an algorithm written in 1962. This is the realization that is starting to hit the collective consciousness in 2026. The veil is finally starting to thin around the Signal Zero towers. The declassified pages suggest that the business plot was just the first room of a much larger house. A house that has no exits. They want to move us to a different timeline where the secrets are still safely hidden. They are preparing the mortal reset for the human race. The question is no longer if they tried to overthrow the president. The question is, when did they finally succeed? The business plot files provide the code to decode the modern world. They show us that power has no limits when it is operating in the shadows. As we turn the final page of this declassified file, the names on the list are still being updated. The ghost planes are still in the sky, and the beast is still in the cloud. The only difference is that now you know who holds the leash on your reality. The train to the stars has left the station, and the corporate Caesar is the engineer. The cargo is the truth. No, the question is, are you ready to see who is really standing on the platform? The final stop is arriving, and the history is about to dismantle your world. The descendants of the business plotters are still in power today. They carry the oligarch legacy in their bank accounts and their neural signatures. By the 2020s, the government realized they had created a new species of human. They are the managed elite. Wait until you see the secret monitoring reports from 2024. They show that the DNA of these old money families is still being shared between the agencies of the global grid. They are looking for the genetic key to the eternal management of the masses. They want to see if the corporate signal is still active in the third generation of the Morgan and DuPont bloodlines. They were looking for the resilient assets to serve as the new guardians for Project Gabriel. The Adam and Eve protocol was now a boardroom reality. But the trauma was also permanent for the rest of us. Survivors of the Great Depression experiments reported feeling a vibration in the wallet whenever they saw the news of a market crash. The CIA files suggest that these weren't just feelings, they were signals. The project had successfully fused financial torture with digital engineering. The subjects of the business plot were the prototypes for the debt-bound citizen. A person whose every economic choice is programmed by a frequency they cannot hear in 2026. Most of the biological ghosts died believing they were living in a free market. They never knew that their poverty was a calculated military objective paid for by the state. They were the fuel for the mighty Wurlitzer harvest of human attention and labor. By the 21st century, the declassified secret was leaking into your banking apps. Tech giants were using the results of mass eviction to keep you engaged and compliant. The methods of the 1930s boardrooms are now the OS for your digital survival. The transition was total. The invisible editor is no longer a man in a top hat. It is the algorithm that predicts your bankruptcy before you miss a payment. The bank is no longer a building. It is the digital network that tracks your every cent in the dark of the night. The declassified memos suggest that the final harvest of human biological and financial data was scheduled for the mid-20s. They were waiting for a specific technological breakthrough that would allow them to sync the entire global population. We are in the loop. Everything we have uncovered points to a single, terrifying conclusion. The war that started in the boardrooms of New York never ended. It just went under your skin. It became your language. It became your future. The factory is still running in the light of day. The documents they tried to burn are finally screaming in your smartphone. And the truth they tell is about to dismantle the history of the world. The kidnapping of the soul was the primary objective of the billionaires. and today they have more souls than they can count. As you close this video, ask yourself one question. How much of your success is actually yours? How many of your choices were programmed into your mind by a man in a white coat 80 years ago? The search for the human trigger has reached your own bank account. Today, in 2026, the business plot is a warning. The signal zero is screaming in your pocket. The declassified charts show that the data from the 1930s handshakes is the foundation for the modern world of technocratic feudalism. We have built a civilization on the silence of the human filters. Every time you follow a market trend, you are reacting to a frequency that was calibrated in 1933. The identity factory has achieved total mental and financial integration of the masses. But there is one more thing you need to consider. The original Smedley Butler report mentioned a final sync. It was a biological marker that only appears in the minds of those who have been reset. The military believed this marker was the key to total global order. Recent leaks from the European Security Archives suggest that this final sync has been found. It is being used to sort the global population into owners and assets. The empathy-free elite from Montauk are using the business data to build their world in the light. The train to the stars has left the station, and the biological ghosts are the cargo. The cargo is the truth. No, the question is, are you ready to see the face behind the mask? The final stop is here, and the declassified history is about to dismantle your reality. Everything we have uncovered points to a single conclusion. The war that started in the boardrooms of New York never ended. It just went under your skin. It became your future. The documents are finally screaming in your smartphone. The secret is out. The final stop of the train is arriving. The cargo is the truth. No, the question is, are you ready to see who is really standing on the platform? The secret is out. The ledgers are open, and the harvest is finally complete for the masters of the world. Are you ready to see the face behind the mask? The light is fading, and the door is closing. But remember, the shadows are always watching, and they have your attention. Be vigilant. The factory is still working. The signal is live in the darkness of the night.